Each year, Volunteers Week is a chance to celebrate and say thank you to all volunteers. And volunteers across NHS Scotland gifted over 100,000 hours of their time in the past 6 months. And during Volunteers Week, we shared some case studies about some NHS volunteers, and the link's been shared in the chat box. Equality, inclusion and diversity are rightly high on many agendas these days. But how can we turn good intentions into real action? It's an issue that those working in volunteering have been wrestling with for many years. We have lots of information about the barriers that exist for people and for organisations, and it's a complex and a challenging subject. The purpose of the webinar today is to share with you the difference that volunteering has made to Sophie Ross, who's a volunteer with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and she will share her story about the incredible difference that volunteering has made to her life. Hi, Sophie. There you go.
Hiya.
We'll then hear from Janice Malone, our Programme Manager for the NHS Scotland Volunteering Programme, and she'll talk with us about the data and evidence that is currently available and share with you the experience and learning from the working group who spent a year investigating, learning and shaping the actions to be included in the Volunteering Action Plan for Scotland, which is due to be launched soon on the 15th of June. Janice will then offer up some positive actions that you can consider for your own volunteering practice. We'll then open up for some questions before finishing up in time for 3 o'clock. So hopefully that sounds good for folks, and a welcome again to you, Sophie. It's great to see you and really appreciate you giving us your time to be with us today. Can I maybe start, Sophie, by asking you to tell us a wee bit about yourself?
Yeah, so as Tony said, I'm Sophie. I currently work at NHS 24 as a call handler. Sorry, my dog's barking in the background. But it's not always been like that. So my mum used to volunteer, and then I lost my mum in 2013, went through a really tough time with my mental health, addiction, and I was unemployed for 7 years. And it was volunteering that got my life back on track. So at the start, it was for myself to build up my CV, but now I do it to help other people because I just enjoy it and I'm passionate about volunteering. And it was the Princess Trust how I got my job at NHS 24. So I was a Princess Trust Young Ambassador for them, took my time out to go and speak to young people about the support is out there if you're struggling, and just to talk to someone about it and ask for help, because that's what I did. And my most recent role was volunteering for the Give and Go service at NHS Glasgow Royal. So I was taking bags up to patients' wards when you couldn't visit, and that was giving that link from the outside world to the patients that couldn't see their loved ones, which I'd want if it was my loved one in hospital. So I really enjoyed that. And yeah, I'm taking a break from volunteering at the moment, just to give myself a bit of relaxation for once, because I can't say no to anything. But yeah, and I'm working today after this. So.
Absolutely. So thinking there, Sophie, about people's individual circumstances and how they can often create barriers to get to volunteering, and you've very, very kindly shared from your own personal experience and the hardship that was there, in the sense and the loss as well. And I'm really grateful to you for sharing that. Is there anything that you'd be happy to share with us that helped you overcome the barriers to getting into volunteering?
Yeah, so I prefer to talk about my struggles, even though it is hard. At least if someone else hears it and it changes their life, then that's all I care about, if it helps someone else. So it was a tough time, and like I said, I got into volunteering to build up my CV, but at the same time it was because my mum used to volunteer. So I think I've always had a volunteering background, but it's just something I love doing. And I think if someone takes their time out, not all volunteering is glamorous, but every role you are doing something to help someone in some way. And it's just putting yourself out there and just seeing what's available, but there's tons of opportunities.
Absolutely. And do you think there's anything that NHS organisations in particular could do more to publicise or do that outreach that you're describing in terms of making communities aware about the volunteering roles?
I think so, because in like NHS 24, this is the first time I've actually known them to do volunteer week, and it's usually me making it popular. I'm like the volunteer advocate of NHS 24. But I don't know, I think it's just something that gives you a pride in yourself because you are helping others, and it's just something I really enjoy, and I just want others to see the impact that volunteering can have on people's lives.
That's great, Sophie. Final question for you then.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to sum up in one sentence or two sentences, what difference volunteering makes for you, what would it be?
Well, it's weird to say I've been on a journey. I hate saying journey, but volunteering has made the biggest impact in my life because it has given me my life back and given me a purpose. Yes, I do have my job, which obviously gives me a purpose as well, but it's just something I really enjoy doing, and I will continue to do it after I've had a wee break.
Brilliant. I have to say, Sophie, I'm really, really grateful to you for your time today and for sharing so openly about your experience, and it's really wonderful. And there's some very, very lovely comments in the chat box as well. And just putting that bit there about sharing lived experience is so powerful. That's amazing, Sophie. I think that sums up the sense that we all have for you there. And so thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
No bother at all. It's an invitation anytime.
A way to save lives at NHS 24 now.
That's great. Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great contribution from Sophie there. Next, I'm going to hand over to Janice for her presentation. Janice.
Thanks very much, Tony. And also, wow, just thank you so much to Sophie. I'm so grateful for you for your bravery and sharing your experience with us today, and to hopefully help other people recognise the difference that volunteering could make for them. So hello everybody, my name's Janice and I use the pronouns she and her. I am white, I am straight, and I am 41 years old. I don't have any religious beliefs, and I have lived experience of mental health difficulties. I grew up in a fairly deprived area and I didn't go to university. I live with my partner Alan and I'm mum to 2 children and a dog. And oh yes, I nearly forgot, I'm also the programme manager for volunteering in NHS Scotland, and I'm also a volunteer. Now that's not usually how we go about introducing ourselves, is it? But just think about how much more you know about me as a person. Much more if I simply introduce myself using my job title. And that's maybe a bit of an extreme example, but when we're talking about inclusion, it's really useful to remember that we're all unique individuals, and much more and much more than in this example, simply just our job roles. You'll see a really useful link to a web page that I have heard about in the chat, which gives some really useful information on the reasons why pronouns are important. Okay, and so today, the things that I would like to talk to you about, and it's really fantastic to see so many people joining the session today. It shows to me that there's a real interest and a real desire to make some change in this area. So I'm going to share with you a wee bit about the data and evidence that relates to inclusive volunteering and some thoughts about what that tells us. We'll explore a wee bit about the barriers to inclusive volunteering, although for those of us who have been around volunteering for a long time, we're probably well aware of what those barriers are. The policy landscape through Volunteering for All, the National Outcomes Framework, and the soon-to-be published Volunteering Action Plan for Scotland. And then I would like to share with you some of the things that I learned during my year as the chair of the National Working Group on Inclusive Volunteering. And finally, to share with you some ideas for you to take away and consider in your own volunteering practice to help you turn your own good intentions into action. And just as we begin this conversation, I wanted to say a bit about who we're referencing when we're thinking about inclusion. Yes, we're talking about the protected characteristics that we have within the Equality Act, but it's actually much wider. When we think about people who are experiencing poverty, homelessness, refugees and asylum seekers, people who are unemployed, people who have been in the criminal justice system, or people who have had addictions. And hopefully, as we've already conveyed to you this afternoon already, people rarely fit into a neat box. And we'll move on now to some of the data and evidence. So the Scottish Household Survey provides the most authoritative national source of participation data in Scotland on adult volunteering. Its 2019 report suggests that volunteers in Scotland are more likely to be female, more likely to be in employment or in education, more likely to be from higher socio-economic and income groups, from rural areas and living in less deprived areas. Now, just a wee note to say that the 2020 data of the Scottish Household Survey has been published, but it's not directly comparable to the previous years due to a change in the methodology that they used as a result of COVID, which is why I'm focusing on the 2019 at the moment. Although interestingly, the 2020 data told us that 65% of adults who don't do any formal volunteering at the moment have said that nothing could convince them to volunteer in the future. And for me, that feels really, really significant and gets me to wondering why that might be. Volunteer Scotland in 2018 produced a report called Volunteering, Health and Wellbeing, What Does the Evidence Tell Us? And what they did was they undertook a literature review, and that involved a really detailed examination of 24 core published papers and a further 40 supplementary papers. And there's so many important findings contained within this report. But for the purposes of today, what I wanted to talk to you about is this really clear-cut evidence, which tells us that those who are subject to exclusion and disadvantage in our society actually have the most to gain from volunteering in terms of their health and well-being. And if that isn't a reason to try to do more in this space, then I don't know what is. Now, the evidence itself relates to people with mental health and physical health conditions and talks about the contribution of volunteering towards improving people's mental and physical health. And really the strongest evidence in that talks about the contribution of volunteering to enhance people's mental health. And that included things like the alleviation of depression, reducing anxiety and stress levels, and actually having a fairly significant impact on some other more serious mental health conditions. It also talks about those who are subject to social isolation and loneliness, and how volunteering can contribute towards combating against that. And I think that's something that many more of us can feel a bit of an affinity for after what we've been through in the past couple of years. People who are unemployed are likely to benefit. And I quote from the report, "We found that unemployed people who volunteer regularly report that their life is more worthwhile than unemployed people who do not volunteer." There's benefits for asylum seekers and refugees arriving. People can become really isolated and their mental health can deteriorate as a result. And a quote from the report tells us they don't want to stay at home, so volunteering gives them a reason to get out of bed every day. Socialising and meeting other women, feeling that they're not alone or isolated, is a really valuable part of the whole volunteering process. And also armed forces veterans who can often find it difficult to reintegrate into life outside the military and as a result can experience mental health problems and isolation and loneliness. Now, the Spirit of 2012 funded some research into the experiences of disabled volunteers and published their report called Volunteering Together, Inclusive Volunteering and Disabled People last month. Now, they hope that this research will help organisations to better understand the background and the needs of disabled people, and to open up more positive volunteering opportunities for disabled people, and to address some of the really harmful stereotypes and disparities that exist. As part of this research, they took a mixed method approach. They did some horizon scanning to understand the context. They reviewed the existing research, articles and published guidance. They also did a quantitative analysis of understanding society, and that's the UK Household Longitudinal Study. And that looked at data that was collected between January 2018 and February 2020, and then again special data that was collected during July 2020 and March 2021 during COVID. In addition to that, they carried out 6 organisational case studies with interviews and focus groups with staff and volunteers who were disabled and non-disabled. And this report takes a look at 3 things. It looks at who are disabled volunteers. It looks very importantly at the experience of disabled volunteers when they're volunteering. And it looks at how organisations engage with disabled volunteers. And finally, it provides some conclusions and some ideas for action in its final chapter. The research really shone a light, I should say, on the enormous contribution that disabled volunteers make, despite all of the inequalities that they face. And I was quite surprised to learn that the findings show that disabled people are volunteering just as much as non-disabled people. And actually, they tend to volunteer more frequently and for longer. And that means that there are probably more than 3.6 million disabled volunteers across the UK, given on average about 12 hours a month. Now, the report itself provides some really interesting conclusions and some ideas for action. There are 22 of those which are directed at staff who are working in volunteer management, and then a further 11 that are directed at policymakers. And I wanted to just pull out a couple of them to highlight today. One of them was around the need to improve our understanding of how the social model of disability can be implemented in practice, and really shifting our focus away from what somebody's impairment is, and instead focusing our attention on meeting an individual's needs and removing the barriers that they face. One way to help to do that, I think, is being able to provide flexible volunteering opportunities when you can. It's not always an easy thing to do with limited resources, but certainly I think the pandemic has shown us that that can be done. There's something important in there around linking together your organisation's equality, diversity and inclusion strategy with your volunteering strategy. And I'll say a wee bit more about that later on in the presentation. We should be paying attention to the culture in our organisations and to the attitudes of staff and volunteers, because the culture of your organisation will have a huge impact on whether your organisation is appealing to a prospective volunteer, or even whether existing volunteers want to stay. Relationships are hugely important. We must build trusted and supportive relationships with our volunteers. We need to create a safe space for volunteers to feel comfortable to tell you about their support needs. If we can take an asset-based approach to volunteering by focusing on the value and the contribution of the volunteer and the lived experience that they bring to the role, rather than trying to make volunteers fit in to our predetermined ideas. And to acknowledge, as we've already shown today, I think in a few different ways, that people have intersecting identities and that disability is not one-dimensional. Not everyone with a support and access need will identify as a disabled person, for example. And from that, what I take is that we should make it common practice to ask everyone if they have any support or access needs, and not wait for volunteers to ask for help or to identify themselves in a certain way. Okay, now let's move on, and we will take a wee brief look at some of the barriers to inclusive volunteering. The National Inclusion Group, which is a national strategic group in Scotland, which is made up of over 20 organisations and led by Volunteers Scotland, have created this visual, and it details, even just looking at a glance at it, the complexity of the barriers to inclusive volunteering. Now, that might be a wee bit difficult for you to read, but we'll share it in the chat so that you can take a look in more detail later. I've picked up a few of the barriers just to highlight today. The first one being people's perceptions of volunteering as an individual. There can be fear there around perhaps having to disclose really personal information about your health, or if you have a criminal conviction, for example. It can be a real barrier for people to take that step. There's the volunteer involving organisations' perception of people, and quite often I've heard staff feeling ill-equipped to be able to think about inclusion and feeling that they're worried about perhaps causing offence or making a mistake. There's a lot of stuff around language, not least the challenge of completing paperwork or attending interviews to become a volunteer, especially if you're somebody who's not that confident with reading and writing. And then those practical issues that volunteer involving organisations will know too well around lack of capacity and resources to properly manage and support volunteers. And that's maybe particularly important when you're supporting people with additional needs. So that gives you a flavour of some of the barriers that we know exist out there. But what can we do to make real impactful change? That's why we're kind of here today. In terms of the policy landscape, the Scottish Government recognises the importance of inclusive volunteering, and it was a key outcome area in Volunteering for All, the National Outcomes Framework, which was published in 2019, along with 4 others. Those were policy impact, lifelong engagement, places and spaces, and recognition and celebration. And you can see them on your screen. Now, Volunteering for All was published in 2019. But due to COVID, the development of the action plan was delayed. And so work got underway in early 2021 to set up 5 working groups relating to the 5 outcome areas. And those working groups were tasked with developing the actions for each of those outcome areas. It was my absolute pleasure to chair the working group on inclusive volunteering. And over the course of just over a year, 24 individuals committed huge amounts of time, energy and passion to improving inclusivity of volunteering in Scotland. These were people from a whole range of different organisations which formed our core working group, and we also worked very closely with the National Inclusion Group in Scotland. And I would really like to just take a wee opportunity to say a very public thank you to each and every person that contributed to that work, because as we know, those who were involved, it was not easy. We were aiming to use a completely new approach called human learning systems. And this approach took us out of our comfort zone, and so far out of our comfort zone, I can't even tell you. But by its very nature, what that allowed for was collaboration and for continual learning and exploration. And that's something that will be baked into the Volunteering Action Plan as it spans its 10 years. And that approach was, rather than some of those more traditional, sometimes linear approaches that we might be a wee bit more comfortable with. So we took it on and we took on the challenge, and our first task was to look at the scope of the work. What we needed to do is we needed to agree what was the scope of the work and what was it not, what were not within our scope. When we had defined what our scope was, we, with support from Volunteer Scotland, reviewed all of the existing evidence that was there, helping us to understand what it was telling us, but probably more even importantly, what it wasn't telling us. Then we moved on into our next phase, which was around mapping, and this was the largest piece of work. So there was a number of things within this that we wanted to find out about. We wanted to know who was doing what in this space and where were the examples of good practice, and there are many, I have to say. We wanted to map out which organisations are out there who would have a vested interest in this area moving forward. We looked at things like which other government policies would have an impact on this work. And we also looked at what are the resources and the funding and the, all of the different things that already exist as a foundation to begin to build upon. And from that period of really deep exploration, what began to surface quite quickly were the gaps, the questions that needed to be answered, and the opportunities for change. We then considered themes, and that involved taking all that we had learnt over the course of the first 3 bits of work that we had done, and then theming that information. We took those themes and we began to create specific actions and ideas for change, which are reflected in the new volunteering action plan for Scotland. Now, I hate to disappoint you, but there are no spoilers today, I'm afraid. You will have to wait until the 15th of June to find out the detail of what's in the action plan. But that year was a really impactful learning experience for me. I consider myself really, really lucky to have had the time to dedicate to that learning. And I thought I'd spend just a few minutes now reflecting on what I learnt with you. I learnt that being inclusive is fundamental to so much in our lives, and that if we're really able to mindfully focus in this area, that we can learn and grow in ways that we just couldn't imagine. For me, it felt like a really overwhelming topic when I took on the role as chair. But one of the big things that I learned is that there really isn't any need to try to do everything all at once. If we can take one small thing that you want to change at a time, those small changes will eventually lead to a big change. And please don't underestimate your power as a volunteering professional. You have the ability to make change. Now, it doesn't have to be a huge groundbreaking change, but if we all strive to understand the points of view of people whose lives are different than our own and make those small changes, we can make that shift into becoming more inclusive. And imagine the difference that we could make if we all commit to making those small changes. Over the course of that year, a question kept coming to me, and it was around how can we be more solution focused in this area? And for me, that was around changing my mindset from this is just too big a subject to, like I said, tackling one small area at a time. Thinking about the changes that we can make that are within our gift, that don't come with a really hefty price tag or don't need approval from others. Volunteering for me is all about being person-centred, and I really love the approach of what matters to you, and that is a healthcare focused movement, and it's based around asking patients what it is that's important to them, really listening to what people are saying and then acting on what people tell you. And I think that we can use the idea of what matters to you in volunteering. If we ask potential and existing volunteers about what matters to them, what support they need as an individual, unique human being, we can have those really meaningful conversations. And today also happens to be What Matters to You Day. And if you want to find out a bit more about that movement and the information, you can find the website address in the chat box. I've also learned that there might well be a significant gap in our knowledge. And that relates to something that I said earlier on about equality, diversity and inclusion strategies. I wonder, do we really know how diverse the staff are who are working in the volunteering profession? Do we as a profession reflect the diversity that we're trying to achieve? Do our organisations then reflect the diversity that we're trying to achieve? And for me, there's definitely a case for really considering how we develop those strong links between our organisational equality, diversity and inclusion strategies and our own volunteering strategies. And finally today, I'm going to leave you with some questions and hopefully some ideas for you to take away and think about. As I've mentioned before, volunteering professionals have the power to make decisions on a whole range of topics. I will pick out just a few. If you think about the processes that you use, what are the small changes that you could make to the way that you operate that are within your gift? For example, is the language that you use to write your adverts and your role descriptions in plain English is easy to understand and is it as inclusive as it could be? Have you tested them out with organisations and user groups to see how they land? are there other places that you could think about advertising your volunteering opportunities that might reach a different audience? Have you looked recently at the forms that you ask prospective volunteers to complete? And for example, do you only ask people if they're male or female? You can make a small change here to be more inclusive, because many people don't identify with these labels today. Do you ask people for their preferred pronouns? Do you work to make sure that you remember them and that you use them? Because by using more up-to-date and inclusive language and questions that better reflects today's society, you're signalling to prospective volunteers that you're working to be more inclusive. Take a wee look at the link that's been dropped into the chat about designing forms for gender inclusivity. That gives you some ideas around what you might want to think about in that area. Now, do you collect equalities monitoring data? Many of us do. But what do you do with that information? Really useful to understand why you're asking these questions and how you can then use that to inform your work. You can use that data to help you think through and plan where you would like to focus your efforts in becoming more inclusive. And the same goes for other tools like equalities impact assessments. Do you do that within your volunteering activity? Again, it's another tool to help you understand where you might be able to make a change. You don't need to tackle the whole inclusion agenda in one go, but by taking small and manageable steps and then embedding these into your normal practice, you're a wee step closer to where you want to be. And if you continue on that path in time, you'll have moved significantly closer to where you want to be. One thing that I learned and I've reflected on quite a lot over the past year is that when you've identified a particular area that you would like to make a change in or improve upon, there's a real importance to connect with organisations and groups, to develop the relationships with people who've lived experience of a particular issue, and to learn with them and to understand the changes that you might be able to make. There's a bit of a starter for 10 available for some of that stuff. In the chat bar, you'll see a link to Volunteer Scotland's inclusive volunteering page. And here you'll find a range of top tips. These top tips have been written by organisations, which can help you when you're thinking about becoming more inclusive in a particular area. And then a bit of time for personal reflection. It's probably something that we don't do enough. We all have biases, conscious and unconscious, and it can be really important and useful to spend a bit of time trying to understand your own. I recently found a research study by Harvard University, and it's called Project Implicit. Now, what it has is a series of bias self-tests, not easy to say, that you can take. And when you take those tests, what they do is they're able to provide you with individual feedback on some of your own biases based on the answers that you give. And it was really interesting when I took them to see what my responses indicated. And if you wanted to have a wee look at that, and we'll drop the link into the chat for you too. I also recently took an online quiz, which I found useful in my own self-reflection. Now, this one is definitely not scientific, but it asked me a huge range of questions about my own experience of being discriminated against in a whole range of situations. And it really got me to thinking about the range of exclusion and discrimination that people might have faced in their lives that I would have no experience of. And so for that purpose, it was a really, really helpful exercise. And we're going to drop the link for that one into the chat for you now. And so I hope that you've enjoyed listening to my presentation, and I hope that there's some useful things for you to take away and consider in your own practice. I'd be more than happy to hear any comments or take any questions. Thank you.
Janice, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. First of all, a huge apology for the hay fever powered coughing that happened during your presentation.
Okay.
I do apologise for that. The wee mic was still on, so and apologies to our participants as well for having to endure that. That was a jam-packed presentation full of fantastic information, and there was so much in there that resonated with me. And that if I could, before we get into our Q&A, please, if any participants want to raise your hand, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment about what you've heard today, and you can also be using the chat box. The chat box has been feverish with comments, which is absolutely fantastic. The thing that occurred to me and really resonated with me, Janice, was your comment there, which I completely agree with, about the need to just take your time and not feel daunted by what feels like to folk who are not steeped in this, to be an ever-changing, ever-evolving area of public discourse where there is genuine fear that folk make mistakes, and because of that fear of making the mistake, it becomes a barrier to people wanting to engage with it. And I think Carolyn, and she'd put a comment in earlier there around the use of the term, Carolyn, sorry, I don't mean to pick it up, but it was a really good point. The movement away from the term preferred pronouns to just dropping the preferred bit, because that would suggest it's an option. Yes. And so folk might be just getting their head around preferred pronouns, and then there's so it's just your reflections on that in terms of how that what we can do practically, Janice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a lot of fear around making mistakes, and there is a lot of fear around doing and saying the wrong thing that might cause offence. But I think that if you approach anything like this around, whether it be pronouns, whether it be, whatever it is, with a willingness to be open to learn and explain to people that you might not always get it right, but this is part of your learning, then most people will be really receptive to that and will maybe point things out to you. And if you can then take on the things that are pointed out to you as a bit of a constructive bit of feedback and then make a change based on that, then I think that that's all that we can do. I mean, we're human beings. We can't always get it right all the time. I know I certainly don't. I try to do my best, and I try to do it with integrity. Yes. And think that's really as much as you can ask of us.
Totally agree. And the point that was also very well made was that even when it is innocent and mistakes happen, there is still the impact that on the individual. So it's a tricky thing, but what we want to try and make sure is that we're taking away that fear of entering into the area of public discourse and making sure that we're doing everything we can, just as you say, to be as inclusive as possible. Janice, thank you for indulging me there. Right, we've got some hands up. So can I come to Derek Todd? Derek.
Hi, my name's Derek Todd. I'm from the Health and Social Care Alliance, Scotland, the Alliance. Nice to meet you. Excellent sharing, Tony. Very well shared. Janet and Dorothy, the presentation you've done, fantastic. Very thought-provoking, very inspiring. It's actually given me some goosebumps. I have a question about inclusive, because the definition of inclusive is a very grey area for lots of people. And for me, quite annoyingly, a lot of people say we're inclusive, but they're thinking inclusive from a physical disability perspective, but not a hidden disability perspective. I mean, I have volunteered for almost 30 years. Unfortunately, I'm showing my age. So, but volunteering for 30 years, and I feel it's something to give back, a pride to give back. And I've always struggled to trying to volunteer in the NHS. Sometimes you don't know what opportunities are there, and often it's a language and communication barrier that many of them do not have a budget to pay for interpreters or electronic note takers. And many deaf people want to become a nurse, want to become a doctor or any other health role, but they want to volunteer first so they can build up their skills in that. And often people with volunteers, they get paid employment. So that's my ambition, my dream, hopefully on my bucket list. So how do we, I mean, I understand Tony was saying you're a fear. You're right, you're a fear because you don't know what to do. Am I allowed to do that? Am I allowed to do the hard of hearing? All you need to do is just ask the person. So it's all about talking to people. So we maybe a bit more education and training. But when you do redoty, is it possible that redoty can be fully inclusive communication? Because I know people saying that there's automated text in the bottom, but that's not acceptable because that is automated. It's not actually picking up the person's voice because you're very strong class vision. You can't pick up everything. So you pick up the wrong thing. So there is actual proper subtitles on the phone and tell them voice over that more friendly for people with dentistry or to get back to the community and to put NHS and volunteering. I do feel guilty for not volunteering enough in the last 2 years through COVID because the communication language barrier, and I feel that graduate to all the other people, but that was my barrier to me, that I couldn't get back to people in COVID situation. But thank you again for the presentation.
Oh, no,
Very
you're very
welcome.
welcome. You're very welcome, Derek, and thank you for your really well put thoughts and comments. I've got a number of things swimming around my head now based on what you've said. I think that within the NHS we can and should get better in all of these areas. And in fact, it is part of our volunteering programme strategy over the next 5 years to begin to take a focused look at inclusion and volunteering right across the NHS and look to see how we might be able to improve that. Because you're right, there are so many people out there who use volunteering as a route to kind of test the water, to find out whether this is the right thing for them. But actually, if that barrier is there, you know, for people like yourself with sensory impairments, then you know, then that's something that we really must do better on. We absolutely must do better. And I would really love actually to keep in touch with you as we begin to embark on some of this work. I would think it would be really wonderful to continue to have you involved and have your insight to help to steer us in some of the right direction.
Janice, I wholeheartedly agree, and I think when we're moving into a time now where there is continued budgetary pressures, and we have to be at the vanguard of making sure that things that the inclusivity and accessibility are not seen as low-hanging fruit for efficiency savings to be made on, and they need to be protected. So more power to our elbows here to try and move that forward. I really, really welcome what you're saying there in terms of the future involvement for Derek. Can I go now, Lorna? Can I give you an apology because your hand was up first, and I've just noticed that. So, Lorna, if you wouldn't mind switching your camera on or
switch my camera on so you can see me.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was absolutely amazing. One of the things that struck me the most is I'm interested in doing improvement advisory work within the Scottish Government, and I need a piece of work to take forward, and this seems like the ideal piece of work. Given the fact that, you know, we're supposed to be inclusive, you know, we're supposed to be person-centered and all the rest of it. I was recently labelled as having a disability given my mental health issues, and I feel that within the NHS that's something that kind of it sticks with you. It's that label, and that's me being with the NHS for 30 years. So I don't know how we can get volunteers through within health and social care and within different organisations. But certainly I've taken away the websites to have a look at, and it's something that I would really like to progress from start to finish, if that was okay, in terms of the the improvement advisor work. It seems like I was kind of struggling with what kind of work I would do until this presentation came up, and I thought, you know, it's very interesting. We still have the same kind of issues, you know, in terms of getting people into employment and even volunteering. So yeah, so thank you for that. And yeah, I'll certainly do more research on it. It was very
I would be
interesting.
delighted to connect in with you on that, Lorna.
That would be good.
If there's any joint working or anything that we're able to do, you know, and thanks as well for sharing your own personal experience. It can be difficult to share that you've had mental health difficulties, as I have. But I think that the more that we can normalise that, you know, the less stigma there is. So more power to you for being brave enough to say that. But please do get in touch, and we'll have a conversation.
Absolutely, because it's a kind of, the cohort starts in August, so I'll do some research up until then, and then I'll get in touch with you, and that would be great.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lorna.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Lorna, thank you so much. That's brilliant. I'm not seeing any other hands up, so should we move to the chat box? Oh no, there's a hand. There's a hand. Ian McConnell.
Oh, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Ian. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I found it quite interesting so far. Thanks a lot for this. I suppose 2 quick points really. So obviously inclusion seems to be the word that we're using the most, but actually I think that's kind of underpinned by respect, isn't it? We've not used the word respect, I don't think, at all in the first 50 minutes of the conversation, and really it's about respecting the individuals for who they are and what they can offer you as a volunteer. Second thing is, I mean, how do you prove that an organisation isn't inclusive? You know, so for example, I've got volunteers who have got physical disabilities, who have declared mental health, poor mental health. You know, but I don't openly signal that I'm happy to recruit these type of these volunteers who have disabilities or issues along those lines. So should I be, in my recruitment material, should I be signalling on that material that I'm happy to, or of course I'm happy to recruit anyone with any type of additional need, or do I just wait for them to hopefully contact me? So I wonder if anyone's got any thoughts on that.
Well, I suppose to maybe kick us off on that, and I think you're absolutely right. Your first comment there about the word respect. It's about respecting each and every person as an individual and what they bring, because everybody brings different things. On your point of should you be actively going out to recruit, in terms of saying, you know, we welcome applications from volunteers, for example, with physical disabilities. I suppose my gut feeling is to say yes, we should. But I think that the consideration around some of that is are you set up enough to be able to support them? Because I suppose that if you kind of went straight to that, then you may end up giving somebody a poor experience inadvertently by trying to do something good but not been set up in the right way. And so for me, I would advocate for thinking about, where the gaps are within, you looking at your equalities data and things like that, and maybe looking at a particular area and making connections with those groups and with those user representatives, and opening up that conversation with them about, am I ready to be able to absolutely explicitly say, we're open to being able to support these groups, or what changes might I be able to make to either be more attractive and more appealing to various different communities and groups, or actually just for the volunteering experience to be as good as it can be when they join you.
How does that sound, Ian?
Yeah, that's great. I think Janice has got a really relevant point there. That's, there are certain roles within NHS Highland that may not be appropriate for certain individuals because they require certain physical attributes and they require certain physical qualities, or maybe even actually some certain personal qualities. So I suppose it's about finding that balance between being inclusive and respecting people, and being able to provide them with a role that works for us and that adds value to what we're doing as an organisation, but which also gives the volunteer a chance to contribute. So yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Ian. Okay, we're going to move to the chat box. Stu, there you are, Stu.
Hi, Tony.
Hiya. What's the highlights from the chat box?
Well, the highlights of the chat box would take a while. There has been some fantastic chat, so I'm not going to go through all the comments that have been there. I will highlight one which I quite liked, which was the best webinar I have been on in recent memory, which is pretty good. Unfortunately, I can't credit that to anybody because that person joined as a guest and it is just showing as guest. But there's only one question that I can note that's a specific question rather than just a comment, which is from Derek Todd again. Do we have volunteer mentors? He says mentors or coaches are really useful to support individuals, whether they're staff or volunteers. So that's the only question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of places will buddy up people with maybe more experienced volunteers when they begin in their volunteering journey, but I don't know whether we have specifics in terms of kind of mentoring and coaching roles. But another wee seed planted there, Derek. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
So like I say, that's everything from the chat box in terms of questions, but I'm sure you'll enjoy reading it later, Janice.
Absolutely. That's fantastic, and I think, I mean, I don't know about you, Janice, but I think there's certainly scope for us to be revisiting this regularly as a topic.
Yes.
So I'm really, really grateful to you for all the work that you've put in the preparation and for your presentation today, Janice. It's been fantastic, and also very grateful to participants for the richness of the comments within the chat box. I can assure you, every one of them will be looked at very, very carefully indeed, and that will help us in the planning for future webinars. I'd also really like to thank Michelle, who's done a sterling job for us today with the interpretation. Michelle, thank you so much. It's been great having you here. We will always welcome feedback about our webinars and suggestions for any future topics. And just to reassure you, we'll be sharing the presentation slides and the recording on the website and the materials that were linked in the chat box as well. I know there's been a particular ask around the barrier diagram. I think we had a wee bit of a difficulty uploading it, so we'll make sure that we're able to sort that out. We may get in touch with you from time to time to find out more about your experience of the webinars, or you can contact us via our events and publicity officer. That's linda.young14@nhs.scot. Our next webinar, here's the plug, our next webinar will be engaging innovatively on social media, and that's on the 13th of July at 2 p.m. And again, you can get more information about that on hisengage.scot/events. There's also a direct link, I think, that should be getting added to the chat box as I speak. So it's been great. This has been a fantastic webinar. I'm grateful to everyone who's contributed to it. And I'm going to give you the gift of 5 minutes of time back. So we're finished in 5 minutes early. And I very much look forward to seeing you on the next one. So thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.